Marcus Johnson pulled his thin jacket tighter as the cold Boston wind whipped around him. Winter was coming, and he knew this year might be harder than the last two he'd spent on the streets. His fingerless gloves, found in a church donation box, didn't do much against the cold, but at least they let him count the few coins in his pocket. $2.35. Not enough for both food and hand warmers today. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. The soup kitchen on 5th Street wouldn't open for another 4 hours. Just another day, he muttered to himself, his military training still showing in his straight posture despite his ragged clothes. Even after 2 years of homelessness, some habits from his 14 years in the Army wouldn't go away. Like scanning every street corner before turning, or sitting with his back to the wall in the shelter when he could get a spot. A police siren wailed in the distance, and Marcus flinched. In his mind, he was back in Iraq, the sound becoming the warning of incoming mortar fire. The street around him disappeared, replaced by dusty buildings and the smell of burning fuel. "Get down!" he shouted, dropping to his knees on the sidewalk. A few passers-by jumped away, hurrying past the crazy homeless man. A businessman in an expensive coat muttered something about druggies as he walked by. Marcus closed his eyes tight, counting backward from 20 like his last VA counselor had taught him. By 12, the sounds of Boston traffic returned. By 5, he could feel the rough concrete under his hands instead of desert sand. At 0, he opened his eyes, his face burning with shame as he stood up. An old woman across the street was watching him with sad eyes. She started to reach into her purse, probably for some change, but Marcus turned away quickly. He didn't want pity. He wanted his life back. He wanted to sleep through the night without seeing Thompson's face, without hearing Rivera's last words, without feeling the weight of Garcia dying in his arms. Finding a quiet alley, Marcus slid down against the brick wall, pulling out the worn photograph he always carried. 6 soldiers smiled back at him, their arms around each other's shoulders. Desert camo dusty, but spirits high. It was taken 3 days before the mission that changed everything. "I'm sorry, guys," he whispered to the faces of his fallen friends. "I should have seen the signs. Should have known it was a trap." His fingers traced the faces of Thompson, Rivera, and Garcia. The only survivor of their squad besides himself had moved to California. Marcus hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. The sound of his stomach growling again made him put the photo away carefully in his jacket's inside pocket, right next to his bronze star, the medal he couldn't bring himself to sell even on the cool, hungriest days. The soup kitchen was still hours away, but maybe he could earn some change helping unload trucks at the market. The workers there sometimes gave him fruit that was too bruised to sell. As Marcus stood up, his joints stiff from the cold, he saw dark clouds gathering overhead. Snow was coming early this year. He thought about the coming winter, about how hard it was getting to find warm places to sleep, about how each day seemed colder and longer than the last. "Maybe it's time to give up," he said quietly to himself. The VA hospital would take him in, put him in a ward with other broken soldiers. He wouldn't have to fight anymore, wouldn't have to pretend he was getting better. But as he stepped out of the alley, something caught his eye. A group of people with cameras was setting up near the park where he usually spent his afternoons. A large black SUV with tinted windows had just pulled up. Marcus turned to find another spot to spend the day. He hated cameras, hated the documentaries that sometimes came through, filming people like him, making their pain into entertainment. But before he could leave, he heard a familiar voice, one he'd heard many times on TV. "Hey, brother, got a minute to talk?" Marcus froze, not turning around yet. That voice belonged to someone he'd admired for years, someone his nephew used to talk about constantly. But what would someone like that want with someone like him? The first snowflake of winter drifted down between them as Marcus slowly turned around. The massive figure of Shaquille O'Neal stood before Marcus, and for a moment, the veteran forgot about the cold. At 7 feet tall, Shaq was even more impressive, in person than on TV. He wore a perfectly tailored black coat, but his friendly smile made him seem less intimidating. "Sir," Marcus responded automatically, his military training kicking in as he stood straighter. His face flushed as he became aware of his dirty clothes and untrimmed beard. Shaq's security team moved closer, probably worried about Marcus's sudden movement. But Shaq waved them back with one large hand. "I noticed something about you from across the street," Shaq said, his deep voice gentle. "You've got that military bearing. Can't hide it, can you?" Marcus's hand unconsciously moved to touch his bronze star through his jacket. "Force of habit, sir. 14 years Army." A camera crew started moving closer, their equipment pointed at Marcus. His heart began to race. The lights reminded him of searchlights in Baghdad, of night missions gone wrong. His breathing got faster. "Turn those cameras off," Shaq commanded, noticing Marcus's distress. The crew immediately lowered their equipment. "This isn't for show. This is just two people talking." Marcus felt his breathing slow down. He looked at Shaq with surprise and gratitude. Most people didn't notice when he was about to have an episode, or if they did, they just walked away. "We're doing a documentary about homelessness in America," Shaq explained. "But that's not why I wanted to talk to you. Something in the way you carry yourself reminded me of my father." "Your father was military?" Marcus asked, remembering something he'd once read about Shaq's family. Shaq nodded. "Army sergeant. Taught me everything I know about discipline and respect." He paused, looking thoughtful. "Would you join me for coffee? There's a place around the corner. No cameras, just conversation." Marcus hesitated. Part of him wanted to run. He'd learned not to trust sudden kindness. It usually came with strings attached. But there was something genuine in Shaq's expression that made him stay. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but—" Marcus gestured to his ragged appearance. "The only thing that matters is what's inside here." Shaq tapped his chest. "And here," he pointed to his head, "everything else can be fixed." A few minutes later, they sat in a quiet corner of a small coffee shop. The owner had started to object to Marcus's presence, but stopped mid-sentence when he recognized Shaq. Now, they had steaming cups of coffee and a plate of sandwiches between them. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Shaq said, pushing the plate toward Marcus. "But I'm curious about your story." Marcus wrapped his cold hands around the warm coffee cup. When was the last time someone had asked about his story? Really asked? Not just for paperwork or records? "It's not a happy story," Marcus warned. "The best ones usually aren't," Shaq replied. "But they're the ones worth hearing." As Marcus took a sip of coffee, his eyes drifted to the television mounted on the wall. A basketball game was playing silently. He remembered watching Shaq play when he was still in the Army, gathering with his squad around a small TV in their barracks. "I was a sergeant," Marcus began slowly. "Had a good squad. The best squad." His voice caught slightly. "Until 2 years ago." Shaq didn't push or interrupt. He just listened, his presence somehow making it easier for Marcus to continue. "We were in Iraq, got intel about a weapons cache." Marcus's hands started trembling around his coffee cup. The liquid rippled with tiny waves. "We don't have to go there," Shaq said quietly. "Sometimes the past needs to stay in the past until we're ready to face it." Marcus looked up, surprised again by this man's understanding. "How did you—" "I've worked with a lot of veterans through my foundation," Shaq explained. "Good people who've seen things no one should have to see, carried burdens no one should have to carry." A comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, but inside the coffee shop, Marcus felt warm for the first time in months. "What if I told you," Shaq said carefully, "that I might have an opportunity for you? Something that would put your skills to good use?" Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Hope was dangerous. He'd learned that the hard way. Every job interview that ended with awkward silence when they learned about his PTSD. Every promising start that ended with a flashback or a panic attack. I'm not the same person I was," Marcus admitted. "Not sure I can be that person." "Again," Shaq leaned forward, his expression serious. "You don't need to be who you were. You just need to be who you are now, but with support, with people who understand." Before Marcus could respond, Shaq's phone buzzed. As he checked it, his eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting," Shaq muttered, looking at Marcus with new intensity. "Very interesting." "What is?" Marcus asked. "I just got some information about your service record," Shaq said, putting his phone away. "There's something you should know about my security company." Just then, a loud crash came from the kitchen. A pan had fallen, but to Marcus, it was the sound of mortar fire again. His vision blurred, his hands gripped the table edge, and the coffee shop started to fade away. The sound of Shaq's deep, calm voice brought Marcus back to the coffee shop. "Focus on my voice, brother. You're safe. You're in Boston. Count with me. 5 things you can see." Marcus blinked, his hands still gripping the table. The coffee cup," he started. "The snow outside. Your black coat. The basketball game on TV. The sandwich plate." "Good. 4 things you can touch. The table. My jacket. The chair. The warm cup." By the time they got to one thing he could taste, coffee, Marcus's breathing had returned to normal. He noticed that Shaq's security team had quietly cleared the coffee shop of other customers, giving him space to recover. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, shame coloring his face. "This is why I can't—" "This is exactly why you can," Shaq interrupted. "My head of security has PTSD too. So do half my Veterans Program employees. They understand. They help each other." Marcus looked up, surprised. "You hire veterans?" "Not just hire them. We create a community. People who understand what it means to serve, what it means to come back different." Shaq paused, studying Marcus. "Tell me about your Bronze Star. The report I just got was impressive." Marcus's hand went to his chest where the medal rested, under his jacket. He hadn't talked about that day in 2 years, but something about Shaq's patient presence made it feel possible. "We were escorting a medical convoy," Marcus began slowly. 3 trucks of supplies heading to a village outside Baghdad. Intel said the route was clear, but he took a deep breath. The first IED took out the lead vehicle. Then the shooting started. We were caught in a crossfire, pinned down. The medical supplies were starting to burn. The coffee shop faded a bit, but Marcus forced himself to stay, present, focusing on the warm cup in his hands. "Thompson, my best friend, he was hit bad. Rivera, too. But there were civilians in those trucks, doctors, nurses, and all those supplies meant for kids." Shaq leaned forward, his expression intent. "You went back in?" Marcus nodded. "Had to. Couldn't let those supplies burn. Couldn't let more people die." His voice got quieter. "Made 3 trips into the fire. Got all the civilians out. saved most of the medical supplies. But Thompson, he stopped, his throat tight. Thompson's last words echoed in his mind. Promise me, Marcus. Promise you'll find him. Tell him about his old man. You saved 12 lives that day, Shaq said softly. The report says you refused to leave until every civilian was safe. Couldn't save my own men, though. Marcus pulled out the worn photograph, placing it carefully on the table. Thompson, Rivera, Garcia, best soldiers I ever knew. Best friends, too. Shaq looked at the photo for a long moment. Family? Sister in Chicago? Haven't talked to her since the funeral. Couldn't face her after everything. She sends letters to my old address. Never opened them. Marcus's voice cracked. Had a nephew who used to love watching you play. Used to tell him I'd get him your autograph someday. We can fix that, Shaq said simply. The letters, the connection. Sometimes the hardest step is just opening the door. Marcus shook his head. You don't understand. I tried to go back to normal, tried 6 different jobs, security guard, construction, even a warehouse. But the sounds, the flashbacks, almost hurt someone during an episode. Can't risk that again. What if you worked with people who know exactly what you're going through? People who've been there? Shaq pulled out his phone, showing Marcus a website. My company doesn't just provide security. We have a whole program for veteran rehabilitation, training, support, counseling. Marcus stared at the screen, seeing photos of veterans in clean uniforms, standing proud. But doubt crept in. Why me? You don't even know me. Because I saw something in you. The same thing I've seen in other veterans who turned their lives around. Strength, honor, the need to serve, to protect. Shaq paused. And because there's something else, something about your service record that... A notification popped up on Shaq's phone. His eyes widened slightly as he read it. Marcus, he said carefully. The promise you made to Thompson, what was it? Marcus's head snapped up. How did you... Because Thompson's son works for me. Has for the last year. And I think that's why you're here today. Some things aren't coincidence. The world seemed to stop. Marcus's hand shook as he touched Thompson's face in the photograph. His son? But he was just a kid. He's 22 now. Joined the company right out of college. Never knew much about his father except that he died a hero. Shaq's voice was gentle. He's been searching for someone too. The sergeant who saved those civilians. The one his father died protecting. Marcus closed his eyes, Thompson's last words echoing again. Promise me you'll find him. Tell him about his old man. Tell him I'm proud of him. When Marcus opened his eyes, they were wet with tears. I couldn't, after what happened. How could I face his son? Sometimes, Shaq said quietly, the bravest thing we can do is keep a promise, even when it hurts, even when we're scared. He stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. The question is, are you ready to be brave one more time? Marcus looked at the photograph, at Thompson's smiling face, then at the website showing veterans building new lives. His hand touched the bronze star through his jacket. What's his name? Marcus whispered. Thompson's son? Shaq smiled, reaching out his hand. Why don't you come meet him yourself? The next morning felt like stepping into someone else's life. Marcus stood in front of a mirror in the hotel room Shaq had arranged, barely recognizing himself. The man staring back wore new clothes, dark blue jeans, a clean white shirt, and a warm black jacket. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair cut short, like in his army days. But his eyes still held shadows of the street, of the memories that haunted him. "Ready?" Shaq's voice came from the doorway. The basketball legend had kept his word, setting everything in motion with a few phone calls. Hotel room, new clothes, doctor's appointment, job interview. "No," Marcus answered honestly, adjusting his collar. "But I'm going anyway." Shaq smiled. That's what courage is, being scared but doing it anyway. He held up a small duffel bag. "Got you something else." Inside the bag, Marcus found workout clothes, toiletries, and at the bottom, something that made his heart stop. A carefully folded security company uniform with Johnson already stitched on the chest. "The job interview is just a formality," Shaq explained. "You're already hired, but there are some things we need to handle first." The morning became a whirlwind. First stop was a medical clinic where Dr. Rodriguez, a VA specialist, gave Marcus a thorough checkup. The news wasn't all good. "Malnutrition," she said, reviewing his blood work. "Early stages of frostbite in 2 toes. PTSD symptoms severe, but treatable." She looked at Marcus kindly. "With proper care and support, you can recover, but you need to let people help you." Next was a meeting with James Cooper, Shaq's head of security. The man's handshake was firm, his stance military straight. "Marines," he said by way of introduction. 2 tours in Afghanistan. PTSD almost destroyed my marriage. Now I help others fight their way back." They sat in a comfortable office overlooking the Boston skyline. The view made Marcus dizzy after so long at street level. Cooper spread out some papers. "Our veteran program has 3 parts," he explained. "Job training, medical care, and peer support. You'll be assigned a mentor, another vet who's been through the program. They'll help you adjust." Marcus nodded, trying to focus despite the height, the unfamiliar clothes, the strangeness of being treated like a person again. "And Thompson's son?" "We'll get to that," Cooper said gently. "First, you need to get steady. Build your strength back. When you're ready, we'll arrange the meeting." The afternoon brought more challenges: a tour of the facility, paperwork, meeting other veterans in the program. Each interaction felt like walking through deep water, hard, scary, but possible if he kept moving. Then came the moment that nearly broke him. They were in the break room when a door slammed somewhere down the hall. The sound echoed like gunfire. Marcus's vision tunneled. His hands started shaking. The break room became a burning building in Baghdad. "Incoming!" he shouted, dropping to the floor. But this time was different. 2 veterans moved instantly to his side. Not to stop him, not to stare, to help. "You're in Boston," one said calmly. "At Shaq's security company. It's 2025. You're safe." "Breathe with me," said the other, a woman with sergeant's stripes tattooed on her arm. "In through the nose, out through the mouth. That's it." Slowly, the break room came back into focus. No one was staring, no one was judging. Some of the other vets had positioned themselves near the doors, keeping others from entering until Marcus recovered. "Happens to all of us sometimes," the woman said, helping him up. She introduced herself as Maria. "First day's the hardest. Too many new things. But it gets better." By evening, Marcus was exhausted. His new apartment, a simple studio provided by the company, felt too big, too quiet after the streets. He sat on the bed, holding the photo of his squad. A knock at the door made him jump. It was Cooper with a small package. "Your sister's letters," he said. "Shaq's people tracked them down. 15 of them, sent over 2 years. He placed the bundle on the table. "You don't have to read them tonight. But when you're ready, they're here." After Cooper left, Marcus stared at the letters for a long time. His sister's handwriting on each envelope brought back memories of home, of family dinners, of his nephew's basketball games. Finally, he picked up the most recent letter. His hands trembled as he opened it. The first words blurred as tears filled his eyes. "Dear Marcus, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I'm still here. We're still here, waiting for you to come home." Another knock interrupted his reading. This time, it was Shaq. "Tomorrow's a big day," the basketball star said. "First day of training. But there's something you should know first." He paused, his expression serious. "The background check came back with something interesting. About your squad. About Thompson." Marcus felt his heart race. "What about Thompson?" "There's more to the story of why his son is here. Something Thompson never told anyone. Something that changes everything." Marcus stared at the ceiling of his new apartment, sleep refusing to come. Shaq's words echoed in his mind. Something Thompson never told anyone. The digital clock showed 3:17 a.m., the same time Thompson had died in his arms in Baghdad. Every night at this hour, Marcus relived that moment. But tonight was different. Tonight, the memory came with questions. What hadn't Thompson told him? What secret could be so important that Shaq wanted to prepare him for it? When his alarm buzzed at 6, Marcus had barely slept. Still, he put on his new uniform, the fabric strange against his skin after years of ragged clothes. The mirror showed a man caught between two worlds, the soldier he used to be and the broken veteran he'd become. His first week of training started rough. Despite Cooper's patient guidance, Marcus struggled with the simplest tasks. During radio procedure practice, the crackle of static sent him back to his last mission. In weapons training, the mere sight of a gun made his hands shake so badly he couldn't hold it. "It's normal," said Maria, who'd become his unofficial mentor. "Your body remembers the trauma. We have to teach it that it's safe now." But was he safe? The nightmares got worse. In them, Thompson spoke different last words each time, trying to tell him something important, something just out of reach. Then came Sarah Chen, the VA counselor assigned to his case. She was younger than Marcus expected, but her eyes held wisdom. "Beyond her years, your sister's letters," she said during their first session. "Have you read them all?" Marcus shook his head. He'd only managed to read 3, each one filled with so much love and worry that it hurt. The latest one mentioned my nephew made varsity basketball. "You're proud of him. He was 9 when I left. Probably doesn't even remember me now." Marcus's voice cracked. "Used to practice with him in the driveway. Taught him Shaq's drop step move." Sarah leaned forward. "Why don't you call them?" "And say what? Sorry I disappeared for 2 years? Sorry I couldn't handle coming home?" Marcus stood up, pacing the small office. "They're better off without me." "Are they?" Sarah's question hung in the air. "Or is that what you tell yourself because it's easier than facing them?" Before Marcus could answer, Cooper knocked on the door. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a situation." The situation was a new trainee, another veteran, having a severe panic attack in the locker room. Without thinking, Marcus followed Cooper. He found a young man curled in a corner, hyperventilating. Something clicked in Marcus's mind, not as a broken soldier, but as a sergeant who used to care for his men. He knelt beside the trainee. "Hey, brother. "You're not alone," he said softly. "Let's breathe together." It took 20 minutes, but the young man finally calmed down. As Cooper helped him to the medical bay, he grabbed Marcus's arm. "Thanks, Sarge." That moment changed something in Marcus. For the first time in years, he'd helped someone instead of needing help. The feeling followed him through the day, making even the hard moments easier to bear. But that night, as he finally opened another of his sister's letters, his world tilted again. "I have to tell you something about Thompson's wife," his sister had written 6 months ago. "She came looking for you, said there was something you needed to know, something about her son." The letter slipped from Marcus's trembling hands. Thompson's wife? She had died years ago, before their last deployment. Unless a knock at his door made him jump. Sarah stood there, holding a file. "We need to talk," she said, her face serious. "About Thompson's family. About why his son is really here." Marcus felt the room spin. "What do you mean?" "The woman who visited your sister," Sarah said carefully. "She wasn't Thompson's first wife. She was his second. And her son. The one working here, he's not the son you think he is." Marcus sank into a chair. "I don't understand." "Thompson had 2 sons, Marcus. The first one, from his first marriage, is the one you knew about. But the second—" Sarah opened the file. "The second was born just before your last deployment. Thompson never told anyone in the unit because—" A commotion in the hallway interrupted her. Voices approached, including one that made Marcus's blood freeze. It was hauntingly familiar, like Thompson's, but younger. "Dad," the voice called out. "Is my dad here?" Marcus looked at Sarah in panic. She gripped his arm. "That's not Thompson's first son," she whispered. "That's his second. The one who's been searching for his father's sergeant. For you." The footsteps got closer. Marcus couldn't breathe. Through the open door, he saw a young man who looked exactly like Thompson did in the old photograph. But this wasn't the son he'd known about. This was someone else. Someone whose existence Thompson had kept secret. Why? The answer stood in his doorway, wearing a security company uniform, with tears in his eyes and Thompson's face, asking a question that shattered Marcus's world. "Are you the man who was with my father when he died?" Time seemed to stop in Marcus's small apartment. A young man in the doorway, Thompson's second son, stood frozen, waiting for an answer. Marcus couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The boy had his father's eyes, the same determined look Thompson had worn on their last mission. "Marcus!" Shaq's deep voice came from behind the young man. "Meet David Thompson Jr., DJ for short." DJ took a step forward, his hands shaking just like his father's used to do when he was nervous. "I've been looking for you for 2 years, ever since Mom told me the truth about my dad." Marcus's legs gave out, and he sank back into his chair. Sarah quickly moved to close the door, giving them privacy. Shaq stayed, his massive presence somehow comforting in the small room. "I didn't know," Marcus whispered. "Your father never told us about you." "He was protecting me," DJ said. "Mom told me he didn't want the enemy to know he had a new baby. Thought it would make us a target." He pulled out a wrinkled photograph. "This is the only picture I have of him holding me. I was 2 weeks old." Marcus's hands trembled as he took the photo. There was Thompson, younger and smiling, cradling a tiny baby. The date stamp showed it was taken 3 days before their last deployment. "Your mother," Marcus said. "She came looking for me?" DJ nodded. "She tried. Went to your sister's house, but you were already—" He gestured vaguely, meaning on the streets. "Mom's sick now. Cancer. She made me promise to find you. Said you were there when Dad died. That he had a message for me." The room spun. Marcus closed his eyes, hearing Thompson's last words again. "Promise me you'll find him."